Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of our podcast, Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about weather and organization design and all the passion topics around it. Hello, Rupert. How are you today?
I'm as always living the dream and living the British
Amazing.
beautiful, British summer. And
Lovely. Nothing
but
like British summer, right?
so all we talk about is the weather and just how great the weather is in Britain. And for those that don't know, I'm from New Zealand, and normally I complain about the weather here, but actually it's all sun and little rain. So what can I say? Happy days.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
But all the more reason for being happy is we have a special guest. Kent, who I've known, Kent McMillan from Accenture, who I've known for quite a few years now. I don't know how long, but it's probably getting close. Well, probably close to 10, I'm guessing, Kent.
I would say so,
Yeah,
easily.
easily, but no, it's rude to count at a certain point. And Kent is a managing director at Accenture on with op model and org design work, and he's also a published author. Recently published his new book, Rethinking Operating Models, came out. So we'll talk about both those things in a bit. But Kent, before we dive into all that professional stuff and org design stuff, it'd just be great to know a bit about you. And welcome.
Yeah, thank
Welcome,
you.
Kent.
No, thank you very much. And great to join you both. And as I said, I think, Rupert, we've known each other a long time, and Shradha, great to really meet properly.
Yes.
I think we have some connections through people, which is fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I guess just in terms of my background, I mainly work on enterprise operating model designs or total company and business units, whether that's in a growth context, a cost context, or M&A, varies quite significantly. And really, I'm one of the leaders of a team of about 150 specialists who work in this space, and I'm massively passionate about the subject. Right at the end of the day, I think it's the most fun job you can have in the work, because it's really the architect of a company, and I find that a fascinating place to be. And fought pretty much my whole career to get into this and spend time on it. So I remember as an analyst even wanting to do that in our world. I guess just a little bit of background on me is that a lot of people don't know I was actually born on a farm in South Africa, in the middle of nowhere, semi-desert, lots of ostriches, all that kind of stuff. And then proceeded to move to the UK to a fishing community in northern Scotland. Not quite on the islands, but very, very close. And so, yeah, if you want to ask anything about prawns, I know way too much about prawns. Um, and then actually moved down south to London. And so, yeah, quite a bit of movement around. Um, my family is now based in London, which is fantastic. But we are a multicultural family. So my wife is Romanian, and we met in the desert of Kuwait. So quite a different way of catching up. But yeah, so it's a little bit of the kind of, I guess, unknown facts about myself, if that makes sense. But yeah, absolutely passionate
Love
about it.
that.
So if you
What I
hear my
can
son, you might.
That's totally fine. But what I can draw parallels is that people who grow on farm have a propensity towards org design. So I don't
Must
know
be,
you. I
must be.
don't know that you. I don't know if you know that about Rupert, that he also grew up on a farm.
I didn't. So that's
You didn't
perfect.
know
So we
that?
now know
Well,
there is a
yeah,
correlation.
yeah. And actually, my family, way back before the 1840s, came from Scotland,
Awesome.
from Isle of Lewis originally.
Aha.
Yeah, but that's
Well,
a
I was
very
up in
long
a
time
place
ago.
called
So there we go.
Arisaig, and that
Yeah,
is not far from Skye. So quite a
amazing,
fun place in the world.
cool. And
Very
and,
cool.
and Ken, so you've written a book. Congratulations. Why? What was your motivation, and what did you want to bring to the world with it?
Thank you, Rupert. And yeah, it was a big question I asked myself, frankly, as I went through the journey. Um, but I think there were a couple of reasons. I think the first one was I do think we're just facing such an unprecedented level of disruption And it really started to ask some questions around operating model design. What does it look like today versus the past? So with all the technology that's been coming, the geopolitics, sustainability, customer expectations, lots and lots of things shifting. But I think one of the real big ones as well that hit me was just how fast generative AI was advancing. And I think, just to be clear, I think when we talk about that, it wasn't about the adoption curve. So, I'm completely uninterested in the conversation about how fast people started to use ChatGPT. It was faster than Facebook, faster than. Actually, that's been uninteresting. What's really been interesting is just how fast its capabilities been advancing. And that's what excites me and has got me interested. I don't know if we've talked about it before, but there's an ARC AGI benchmark that's used. It's kind of an international benchmark for how well the models are performing. And if I just took something really simple and took what OpenAI's models were doing, 18 months ago, they scored 5%. Now they score 88%. But what does that really mean? Well, they're claiming that means we're now getting to STEM graduate level. And that starts to ask some real questions around how I design an organization. And I think that's been fascinating as we started to do research around this space. And you hear, Jensen from NVIDIA saying there's going to be a 50,000 person employee company of his will have 100 million agents, and that he believes that they're already using thousands, right? So I think there's just something big happening. So that was one of the reasons. And I think the second was there's an awful lot of method books, if you want to put it that way. And I don't mean those in a bad way. They're great. They tell you how do you do op model and org design. What we tried to do was to say, well, actually, let's stand back and think about the challenges that people are facing. And the fundamental difference with this book is we said, what are the challenges that people are facing? And therefore, how do we answer that and help them to think those through? In our case, we identified 6 enduring challenges. And I would argue they're fundamentally the challenges we are repeatedly asked by our clients, right? So whether it is, how do I underpin a new strategy or a new growth plan? How do I get cost out and manage complexity, M&A, all the way through to how do I increase agility of the organization? So these questions just kept coming. So we decided, well, could we write a book instead of it writing about the method and the process that actually looks at those issues and says, well, what would that mean? And how does this new way of the world look when you address those questions? So we think it's the same questions, but the answers are evolving.
And before we go further out, diving into it, because this is all extremely cool stuff, Kent, and I have so many questions. Um, let's take a step back and see that how do you think about the fundamental difference between operating model design versus organization design? Because interchangeably in the corporate world, this terminology is used, and as a practitioner, we find that it's fundamentally different. So, how do we think about it?
Shradha, it's such a good question. And I will say it's created so many philosophical debates, I don't even know where to start. Um, so sometimes I even say, does it matter? But at the same stage, it does in terms of, as a practitioner, what are we really focused on? And the fundamentals for us, or my definition effectively for an operating model, is the interconnected system, the total interconnected system that achieves the business strategy. So if we thought about what are the capabilities a company needs in order to execute on that strategy, then how do we align the structure, the processes, the metrics, the systems, all to underpin that and deliver on that value? And if I made it really practical, it's effectively the blueprint of how the company delivers value. So I think about it as, what's the business configuration or role of center? How does that unit work? What are the different parts, the business units, the functions, geographies? How do they work together? All around the core value streams. Whereas when I really think about org design, we normally are thinking reporting lines, layers, spans of control, roles and job architecture, thinking about responsibilities and allocation of them, races, etc. All valuable things to do, but almost a component, if you will, of the operating model design. So once we've got that clear, we can go down into the org design to build that out. But I know there are lots of people who will merge those, bring them together. But we find it helpful to think about that because this operating model is the big argument that we have, and certainly the CEOs that I've just working with one actually a week ago. I had the whole leadership team there who were really just debating the operating model. Nobody was asking questions around the org design at layers down or the jobs. It was just about what do the big units do and why, and are those the right units? So those are kind of the big questions for me. Um, I think the big piece for me right now, though, is when you then talk to executives about it, they're turning around and telling us we're not ready to have our operating model adapt to the speed of change that we're seeing around us. And I think that's where we're therefore having a lot of conversations.
So, how do you see op model work evolving? Because the world's and be honest, let's put AI to a side for a second, and let's imagine it didn't exist. But how do you see the work of op model, the practitioner work of it, the actual process of doing op model work evolving and changing over time?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because we're spending a lot of time, and even in the book, we spend quite a lot of time on the what the operating model is going to look like, how that's changing, the big shifts. Um, but we've actually spent some time thinking about, well, what does it mean in terms of how do we do the work, right, and what's different? And I think one of the big things I call out is I worry that the technologists are going to design the operating model by accident. Now, why do I say that?
Say
Well,
more about it. Yeah,
if you,
what is
yeah,
designed by accident?
well, effectively, if I was being really simplistic, and this isn't a fair representation, but if I turned around and said, I looked at an organization chart, we now believe that there will be a combination of people and machines to deliver any work. But as we move to this agentic model, and I know that you said, Rupert, avoid the AI, but for a minute, you almost see this as if I'm increasingly having autonomous agents, you could argue they're a node on whatever structure we decide to define. And this is where you start to ask questions. Well, okay, if the software engineer goes off and designs that particular agent, they're building in accountabilities, roles, ways of working in that agent. Now, if that's not connected to the wider operating model we're designing, we've got a challenge. And if we see more and more agents and less people proportionally, the software engineers designing the organization, not us as architects. And I think that's kind of the premise of why I go, whoa, this is a big moment for operating model and org design to kind of go, how do we actually manage that? Yes, in the past, we could always say, well, there were ERPs, there were other technologies. Of course, there were. But those very much were seen as enablers rather than execution of the core. And I think that's something that is going to really change in terms of how we think about it. And one example I give people because they say, well, this hasn't happened before. Well, in recent times, Uber has, right? Fundamentally, it tells humans what to do through an algorithm. On the other end of it, we're really being silly, and I remind people, it's like, have you ever been to a traffic light? Well, in South Africa, we even call them robots, but they are telling you to stop or go. So, it's not new in a sense, but it's now going to be brought to such a level that as an org designer, I don't want to be designing a smaller and smaller component. I need to be able to design with a discipline of knowing the technologies and what they're able to do, which is going to be quite different. And I think it's going to be a big skill uplift for us. Also, I'm sure we'll see software engineers go the other direction and try and learn org design, right? But that will be a fascinating time, I think, for us as we start to say, well, how do you design those things together? At a more radical kind of just day to day, though, how are we redesigning? What I would say is our process, if we did the how do we design an op model end to end, the diagnostics, what you can do now is just incredible. Whether that, we all know that the data is imperfect on organizations. But what we can now draw out using LLMs and other capabilities is a completely new level, and the speed with which we can do it is faster. But even if I was being traditional, Rupert, as you said, and said, forget the AI taking over the work, for us, I used to be able to interview the top 10, maybe the top 20 to 30 people in an organization. I can now create effectively a chatbot that will do the interview for much wider numbers of people at pace. Yeah, that's a practical, you know what I mean? It's just a practical way of thinking about it. And I go, okay, well, that now means I actually can create a better product. I can also feed more data sets into the argument. So that's kind of, I think, some of the things that we're seeing. I know that, Rupert, the work that you did, fantastic at Orgvue, as an example of that automating the journey and making that process go faster. I'm now going, okay, it's a bit like the moment that Satya Nadella at Microsoft called out. Well, the front end software becomes interesting, but is it actually going to be used that way? Or am I going to just write in what I'm asking for? And actually, that's going to leverage Orgvue and other tools just to execute that, right? But it doesn't have to be that I'm interfacing in the way that I did before. So the speed and the amount of analysis you can bring to a client is much faster. And even predictions of what that future is. I have seen a very interesting piece recently where I'm not saying it's perfect yet, but we've literally ingested every Lean Six Sigma book into one of the LLM capabilities in Accenture to say, okay, well, if I now apply it to a process, can the LLM redesign the process? The answer is yes. Is it great and perfect yet? Maybe not. But it shows us a window of what might be possible as we go forward. And I think those are the kinds of things that I'd be thinking about as we think about org design. Um, that's kind of the practical change, I think, to the way that we do the work. I know we've also always talked about trust between human and machine. That relationship is going to get more and more complicated as we think about it. So if I literally did have to design a team where algorithm is asked to effectively manage a bunch of people, you can imagine what that will mean even just in our discussions, right? People will feel very uncomfortable. So I think these are the things that are just in mind as we work through. But that's really the how, right? But at the same stage, we're seeing the what change. And I think that's where we probably focused more on in the book than the how at this point. But it is definitely something we're experiencing in our own practice day in, day out.
Wow, this is all fascinating and scary all at the same time because, we are fundamentally shifting the way we need to think about it and how we need to execute it, and it's daunting. So, as as practitioners, as people who are passionate about org design, what is a common red thread that is not changing that we should always keep in mind? Like, because, there is so many things that we have to unlearn, but what is our strength that we can lead with?
I think it's the systems thinking that we bring, the
Mm,
fundamental systems thinking that an org design person or an operating model design person brings is really the power. The power is we are one of those unique roles that translates the strategy into an execution engine. And I don't think that will ever change. As much as it may be executed through different tools or different ways, what we see is the failure is when those two things don't align and we haven't actually worked them through. And I think that's where the systems view of it's not just a structure because everybody gets obsessed with that, but also that this system must align and enable that strategy is the fundamental. It's the fundamental at the end. And I don't think that will change. We will still also have customers. We will still have people in the organization, even if it's less people. I think some of the discussion around organizations with no people, maybe, but it'll probably be doing something fairly narrow. And therefore, is it really an organization or is it a piece of a ecosystem? And it's more about how we just see organization structures change. But I think that's for me
Yeah.
the key thing.
It's also just building on that. It's the ability to ask questions and to leverage this technology effectively by being the expert. And I think as the technology grows, the level of expertise and insights and ability to ask those
yeah.
questions become more and more important because it's an augmentation of a human being. It's like an assistant, and so someone who's really competent becomes more competent. Someone who's really good at asking questions can ask more questions and better questions. Someone who's great at making connections between seemingly unconnected things and being creative and looking at the world in different ways gets that extra superpower. And I think I was chatting to someone, actually a brand person, yesterday, and I was using ChatGPT to come up with some different icons and things for software. She was getting really nervous about it. She's like, "Oh my god, it's going to take my job." I'm like, "No, no, 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 not in the slightest. It will make you better. You can come up with more scenarios faster, execute." And I think it's that same. I mean, and I think you're saying that as well, Kent. It's that process of being more enlightened. And the thing that worries me, I
Yeah.
guess, a little bit, and be good to get your view on this, is young people coming through, young practitioners who haven't had the luxury of the time that maybe we've had. How would you think advise them? And the people coming up through Accenture, and you've got a large team, learning the things you need to learn to become that expert to actually leverage all this technology in a good way. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating moment. I've always tried to instill in our teams curiosity and courage, and why creativity too, but really those two play into, if we don't have people who are always curious about what the next bit of kit, the next thing coming out can do, we're dead from the start. And I think that's where, I'm excited at least to be on a call with a bunch of passionate people in this space. And I think if you don't have people with that passion, they don't do that, right? But I think it's therefore fundamental to spark that if we expect them to learn the things that are coming. I think on the other hand, they will come with how to apply, and we are seeing this, how to apply the tools of these new technologies in the work we do quicker. And they're doing it already informally. So when a company doesn't do it fast enough, they're going and borrowing the kit and buying it themselves and doing whatever they need to do because they see how much better it makes them do the job. Now, clearly there are limits and we have to manage all of the ethics around it. But what it does mean is often they look at the problem differently than we do already. And I think that is actually a good thing and has always been the case of new technologies. The next generation kind of is native, if you want to call it that. But I think your point, Rupert, and you're pointing out at, which is a challenge, is how do they get to the point of understanding all the different functions that they're going to have to learn? How do they understand the totality of the business and create the main knowledge if, increasingly we don't need analysts? Right, that kind of discussion is clearly happening in the consulting world of like, well, do you need the same pyramids? Are the pyramid shaping changes? Yeah, absolutely, the pyramids are changing. But I think there is a need still to develop that talent and build that capability. It might mean that instead of a big wide pyramid that we had in the past, it will be more narrow, and we're actually investing more into the individuals that we bring in and to get them to that spot. But it is recognized. I mean, you can only look at the outsourcing world as an example of where we started to struggle to find who are the next leaders of those functions within the companies that are all around the world, because the skills were exported and the places that we learned got exported to an offshore environment. Um, Now we just see the talent rotating, which is fantastic. But I think that's going to continue to be an issue here. We need to teach people differently. And I have to admit, when I look at my 7-year-old son, my wife asked the question, is what he's learning at school useful? Is this worthwhile? Yeah, my view, actually, yes, because what I really need him to learn is to, as you said, Rupert, ask questions, be able to judge what's in front of him and not take it at face value. If they get that knowledge, they'll be able to navigate their way through this.
And building and what worries me a little bit about education, particularly when there's too many exams, is take the killjoy out of it, right? It's the passion for wanting to learn, that lifelong
Yeah.
learning, that curiosity, as you said, that's the key thing. And if you have the passion to learn and just invest and get a thrill from that, then you'll grow and have a huge, disadvantage, positive advantage over everyone else because you've got that, and that then becomes the superpower. And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
if you're a 7-year-old, you just want the schools to just harness that. It almost doesn't matter what it is.
Get them
Just love it.
excited
Yeah.
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
about learning.
And I think that is what needs to fundamentally shift in the education because I see my teenager and they just want to use the chat GPT to copy paste right now. Because if they don't want to learn a topic, this is extremely easy to
Yep.
short circuit that. So again, there are always two ways to look at things. But as we are thinking about it, can I ask a question which can make things messier? Which is like, the AI itself is creating so many layers into the way we think about the work. But there was a whole decade that we spent about thinking about the skills and skills based organization. Now we are just moving too fast, too quickly into agentic and AI based organizations. Where is all this going to meet? And is it somewhere a middle ground around it where all of this you see, Kent, as coexisting, or some things will dial down and some things will dial up? How should we see about it? Because everything seems to be like, a view that we had and trying to put together, but it's changing too fast.
Yeah, I guess I'd probably stand there and say that's always happened.
Oh,
Right.
well,
I
that's
think that
that's fair.
we're gonna always have new ideas coming that we're testing, and it will never keep up, right? I mean, even if
Yeah,
you look at what we talk about in the book, just on a technology basis, there's a fundamental gap between our ability to consume all the advances coming and to apply them in a business. And
fair.
that I think will continue for all of us. And I
Hmm.
think what's fascinating to me, and it kind of connects back to Rupert's point on the individual and your point of the learning and the excitement at school, um, we see the same for the total organization. So when I look at total organization of what's going to be the what, it's not about chasing the latest AI trend. It's not even about aiming for average, which I'm being harsh, but too many clients, for example, want to hit benchmark.
Hmm.
You're
And there
never
are
going
no
to win.
benchmark. There are no benchmarks anymore.
Exactly. But it's still going on, right? And it's a big push. And I think the point we're trying to make is no, the ones who are going to win are the ones who set the new performance frontier, the ones who create the new way.
Love that.
And the way we've described it is kind of, it's a culture of reinvention in the whole organization. Well, what does that mean? Well, you have to be comfortable now that nothing stays still and it's all moving, and that's okay. And I think
Mm.
that's what's got us into this world of like, if a company in the future, and we coined it the reinventor organization in the book, right? But it really was saying build new capabilities, reimagine how you operate, and redefine what great looks like all the time. And that's the
Can I
challenge I think we're
can
really facing.
can I offer a reflection here and maybe a debate? So and I'll give you some context. I'm listening to this new podcast. Well, I've been listening to it for a while, but it's called Acquired, and these are two guys based on the west coast of the US that go really, really, really deep into the history of companies and and particularly companies that have been around for a long time. So over the weekend, I listened to the Starbucks one, which was a good 5 hours.
Oh, wow.
I've just listened. I'm almost finished with Hermes, and I also did IKEA not too long ago. And actually, with the Hermes is a really interesting one because, and I didn't because I'm not really the sort of guy that's going to go and buy a $12,000 handbag. I've never stepped inside a the Hermes. I didn't really know anything about them, to be honest with you. And they came out of the world of making leather saddles and things, and they're all craftsmen. And it takes years and years and years to learn the craft, and it's all the old techniques that were there, over 150 years ago, and everything's handmade, and they've stuck. And so and that is their USP. And there was, and no disrespect to, I was a management consultant as well, to management consultants, but management consultants went in and advised them and said, no, you need to outsource, you need to, and they threw that out and they stuck to their knitting because their core capability is craftsmanship and those skills which people value massively. And actually, they don't have huge product innovation, all this kind of stuff, and the scarf and all this, all handmade through really intricate processes. Starbucks was really interesting because every time it seemed to me that Schwartz left, there was a disaster with Starbucks, and he had to come back and rescue it again. And every time he was going back to the values and the core ethics of around their partners, which is the people, the baristas, and that capability and who they were and how they gave the intimacy and building community. And so I think when we talk about strategy, and I think it's quite easy to forget what are those capabilities, what are the things that make your business unique. Hermes is a totally different business model, right? As does IKEA, as and so the importance of the barista,
Mm,
and I think to your point about benchmarking, Kent, like it's all too often people just go and look at something and then try and copy, and that's
yeah.
never a good thing. So that kind of thinking and the ability to think, say, what is fundamental, that's which is really down to strategy and the translation. So what capabilities are unique to us that are our moats and makes us unique? And if that's using craftsmanship from hundreds of years ago, and no one else can do that at scale, and they have like over 200 billion in revenue and everything else, is just insane, and the kind of margins they make, et cetera, et cetera. Wow, look at that. And I think this is the questioning thing. And I think the op model, I think it's so easy to get caught up in the latest and the buzz. And yes, the world's always changing and innovating, but actually some things should stay the same and be harnessed. And there's a paradox in that. Um, so yeah, just a thought.
Yeah,
What
no,
do you think?
I think it's a great push, Rupert, and it's 100% right. It's one of the reasons I said at the beginning. For me, it's that connect between strategy and execution. It's capabilities and aligning all the capability, all the elements of the organization. If we lose that, then we absolutely lose the power of those particular organizations and what they're doing. I think what's fascinating, though, if I took somebody like Hermes, that their core capability in delivering, I'd probably argue they probably have two, right? And big ones. One which might be the craftsmanship, another one will be being able to position it in the world in a way that people are willing to pay a certain odd for the product, which may or may not be fully related to the cost of making the product, right? I think the branding and all the pieces that go around it. So I think there's something in there. We just have to understand for each company what those capabilities fundamentally are. But it doesn't mean that, if suddenly somebody comes in with a completely new way of doing it, and I know it's a bit hackneyed, it's the Netflix blockbuster, there'll be something that flips the switch. Not that the core competency has got to go away, but we need to understand, well, then what was the core competency and how do we keep it? And I think you're 100% right. Trying to keep that tight, even while the world is changing rapidly,
Yeah,
is going to be critical. Otherwise,
yeah.
they won't deliver, and you won't know
and
what the
and
firm
it's
is
not just
about.
one model,
Yeah.
right? You have the Sonys missing out on the iPod, right? You have the Kodaks. I mean, we can reel these off.
Yeah,
But those are the ones. If I'm say for myself, I reel those off all the time. But I've just been listening to these podcasts, and it's just made me think a little bit. Like, hang on, there's some uberly successful companies who've stuck to a model that's
yep.
a set of capabilities that is so unique and so differentiated. That means they
Yeah.
can, for centuries in some cases, charge huge premiums for something that's hard to replicate.
Absolutely.
And
But even
yeah,
the Unilevers, the P&Gs, they've been
yeah,
around a very long time.
very long time. Yeah,
Um, I think you'll also find industry by industry will be quite
Yeah.
100%.
And I would say that all these companies are not successful all the time,
Very
everywhere.
true.
yeah.
And I think when we
Very
see
true.
at a zoom out macro level, we feel that they have been successful day in, day out, but they all have their own small stories and shifts and changes that they have gone through. And that makes them successful because they have their own share of failures, but they have the resilience to come back and course correct. And I think that is something that we miss out on when we talk about the successful story is the successful organizations, that they're always course correcting, always learning,
Yeah.
always thinking about systems.
And there's always a degree. I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, but there's a. I'm just going back to the Hermes example, reinvention, because they put the scarf with people in jeans
Hmm.
to get to another generation. So
Yeah.
Yep.
it's the same scarf, and apparently the scarf was driven by Queen Elizabeth wearing it, and then that so there's always a degree, and then
Yes.
there was how you move from scarf to leather, and so there's always a degree of reinvention, but then with these certain capabilities that are so unique to you, so it's not
Yeah.
throwing the baby out the ball, and really understanding that. And we're almost out of time, but the ability to question, and then to understand and accelerate. So my
And going
goodness,
back
yeah.
to, like, what you're curious about, what you're passionate about, are you connected um, to the capabilities and to the strategies and the vision that you had in the future, in the past? So I think all those things that we spoke about are going to stay forever, are going to continue to make us successful. Things that the point that you said, Kent, that all of these things will keep coming and swirling around us, but we need to keep ourselves grounded and anchored on that. What does it mean for us? And what do we stand for? So, yeah, fantastic.
So
Time is never enough
we never have enough
for these.
time. Never enough time. So Ken, just unfortunately, we have to wrap up. We
No,
could
no,
keep on
absolutely.
going. So just to wrap up, it'd be great to hear from you. One tool that is one of you'll have lots of tools, but one of your go-to tools, and one trap that you would think is good to avoid.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Practical tool, it's always hard to choose one. I, I have to admit, I intentionally, and I'm going to break the rules slightly, is that I have two that I use in parallel right
Of
now.
course, go
Two for the
for it.
price of one. Go for it.
And one, it's fundamentally around the star model, which we've used for
Hmm.
years, the Galbraith star, which you will see we've edited to put data and technology at the heart of it, really because we believe that technology is no longer an enabler, it's a provoker as much, and therefore it has to be aligned. And we've seen that in design in recent years. So there's that side of it. And then on the second is, without being too shameless, but plugging a little bit, that we have kind of identified what we think are 7 kind of key features of organizations as they're moving over the next few years. And I use that as a stress test to say, okay, is the strategy there? Are the capabilities aligned? Are all the elements aligned? And then I ask myself, okay, but how much am I really taking into account continuous reinvention? How much am I really taking into account that technology has changed the cost equation, the cost and complexity equation? Like, to give you a really simple example, I don't want to go too far into this, but if you took a company like Ant Financial versus Bank of America, I mean, customer base wise, they're actually similar, if not bigger, in Ant Financial, but they use a significantly lower number of people to do it. Why? Because the core value chain's been digitized. And I think that's where I'm just saying, you know, I put that stress test on alongside it to say, okay, well, hold on a minute, are we really leaning into this change in the cost and complexity equation? Because it's now made things that we said were too costly now potentially valuable. And I think that's a different equation. And then I think on your point on traps, um, I think really for me, there's the big one is bombastic claims. Um,
Say more about that.
so, I won't mention the company, it's not fair, but there was a company a few years ago in the UK that came out, I'm talking like 5 years ago, and they turned around and said, we're going to get rid of 50% of our headcount through AI tomorrow, well, over the next 3 years or whatever it was, right? But this kind of bombastic claim doesn't take into account big things like your competitors are going to use the same capability. So you've got to choose: am I enriching my product or my service, or am I taking out cost? And that's going to be different depending on the kind of company you are, right? I'm pretty sure Ryanair will make a different decision than Qatar Airways on the same thing, right? And we've already seen, rarely does all the money from that saving go to the bottom line, right? And it's been around for years, right? And for me, the simplistic one is look at the iPhone 10 years ago and today. The price hasn't actually really changed. You can calculate inflation, etc. Does it make a difference? No. The product's offering has changed. I mean, it's quite significantly better, but that doesn't get caught in a productivity number. And I think that's where I'm always just being careful of the bombastic claim I can't tell you, even in this book, I'm not telling you I know exactly what organizations are going to be in 10 years. If I was, I'd be lying. Rather, I'm saying there are some themes and some things that I think are going in a direction. How do we make that happen together? And that's
Fair.
going to be the fun.
That's nice, Kent. Thank you. It's a great way to
This,
word
yes.
word of wisdom at the end there to, I think, give us all a bit to pause on and reflect on. So thank you so much for your time, as always. And Shradha, until next time.
Until next time, Kent, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us time and the wisdom that you have shared with our listeners.
And thank
Really
you for
appreciate it.
inviting me. Thank you.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.